everyone. Again, great afternoon or good morning, depending on your time zone. And most importantly, on behalf of Americans for Financial Reform and United for Respect, we welcome each one of you to this webinar we're titling Surge Voters and Anti-Corporate Inflation Messaging. My name is Maria Rovellino, and I'm the Managing Director of Campaigns and Communications for Americans for Financial Reform. I will pass it on shortly to our colleague and great partner, Teresa Guerra, Chief of Staff of United for Respect, who will also welcome you. At AFR, we are so proud to partner with United for Respect to bring you what we believe is a very timely and important message that we believe will immensely resonate with what we call surge voters or unlikely voters in these elections in November. Just a little about myself. I'm a legislative and political campaign strategist. I've led national federal advocacy campaigns for criminal justice reform and immigration reform and social justice. And I devoted most of my career to the labor movement, where I also was very engaged in political campaigns and got to train thousands of union members and staff to run more sophisticated campaigns. And now a quick word about AFR, Americans for Financial Reform. We have advised on groundbreaking legislation like the Stop Wall Street Looting Act and Reward Work Act that reins in inflation, economic inequality, and racism by attacking corporate greed at its roots and changing the incentive structure for both the financial system and the broader economy to make it work for all of us. Americans for Financial Reform is a nonpartisan, nonprofit coalition of more than 200 civil rights, consumer, labor, business, investor, faith-based, civic, and community groups. We were formed in the wake of 2008, in the crisis of 2008, and we are working to lay the foundation for a strong and stable and ethical financial system because we need it. One that serves the economy and the nation as a whole. And we have been called the leading voice for Wall Street accountability, so we're pretty proud about that. Now, a word about why this poll we are bringing this to you in coalition with United for Respect, and why does it matter for us so much? Because we believe that economies are made, they're not born. And Wall Street has undeniably too much power on how they're shaping our economy. This poll that you're going to be introduced to shows that hardworking and sometimes underpaid workers and people of color and lots of communities who sometimes have to have two jobs just to make ends meet understand all too well that power that the ultra-rich corporations and their buddies in Wall Street have on our economy. They definitely understand the anti-corporate and inflation message because they experience it personally. The impact of inflation and the price gouging that they see because their rent goes up, because they drown in medical debt, because sometimes it's hard to put food on the table. So they know that Wall Street and big corporations and private equity are impoverishing us. And this is why at the heart of our organization, it is to bring justice to these communities. And honestly, we have a golden opportunity in November to elect politicians who will fight for them and who will take on Wall Street and regulate and tax the ultra-rich appropriately. The organizations in our coalition demand this, and this is why we fight at the federal, regulatory level, and legislative level for financial and economic justice. Now, I'd like to just really quickly tell you what we're going to do today, and then introduce you to our talented speakers. What is up next is you're going to receive a couple questions on a poll, and then you're going to hear from Chief of Staff of United for Respect, Teresa Guerra, who will also give you a welcome and describe the goals of our project. After that, we hear from Brian O'Donnell from Data for Progress, who's going to tell us about the poll findings in more detail, in more technical detail. And then we will come with Doyle Canning from Skyridge Strategies, LLC, who will talk to us about a toolkit that we've put for you so that you can take it on and put it on the ground ASAP. You can hit the ground running with this. After that, we are going to hear about the field, what we call the ground, right? From Jess Newman from United for Respect, that's going to tell us about how is this message already working. And then we want to be brief and just devote as much time as we can for Q&A. The Q&A will be done through the chat, so please, I welcome you to think about what are your questions, write them down on the chat, and send it to us right when we are done with the presentation. Okay, let me just introduce you real quick to our speakers. Doyle Canning, first of all, who has provided narrative strategy, public affairs, and management consulting through her firm, Skyridge Strategies. Doyle is a co-founder of the nonprofit Center for Story-Based Strategy, and she developed the pedagogy of narrative power analysis, training thousands of activists and advising over 100 organizations from the grassroots to the global level for the last 20 years. Doyle authored the handbook, Imagining Change, How to Use Story-Based Strategy to Win Campaigns, Build Movements, and Change the World. And in 2017, which was a prominent strategist, Republican strategist, called her the most dangerous book in my library, or indeed in the world. So this is Doyle, and we cannot wait to hear what she has to say. Ryan O'Donnell is the electoral director at Data for Progress, where he focuses on leading the electoral polling and strategy of the organization. He's worked in politics for the last 15 years. And prior to Data for Progress, Ryan worked organizing for campaigns like for Barack Obama, to being a data director at SCIU. With his guidance, Data for Progress polling has been cited among the most accurate pollsters in the 2020 primaries and general elections. Last but not least, Jess Newman is the political manager at United for Respect and joined the policy and politics team over 2 years ago, helping to build the organization's first comprehensive direct voter contact program in 4 states, Michigan, Georgia, North Carolina, and Texas. Prior to United for Respect, Jess worked in various roles in electoral, political, and labor organizing, most recently at the as the national relational organizer for Bernie 2020. Okay, that was a mouthful. I hope that you're now fired up and ready to go. And I'm gonna go ahead and pass it on to Teresa. But before I do that, I would love to introduce you to someone who you can't see, but you may be able to hear, our talented director of digital director, Isis Kenny, who is going to throw a poll at you right now. We have a couple of questions that are exciting for us to know. And here they are. Does your organization run electoral work? Let us know, please vote, yes or no. And what type of electoral work do you do? There's several options here: door-to-door, phone banking, text, digital ads. Oh, I see you voting. Thank you so much. I'm going to give you 30 more seconds. And wow, okay, I see you folks voted. Let me take a picture of this beautiful graph. Thank you. And now we can end the poll now. Thank you so much. And share results. Here are the results. 68% of you are running electoral work. And I see you do a bunch of work on all the options: doors, phone bank, text, digital ads, all equally almost. Wonderful. Thank you all so very much. Now on to Teresa, our dear friend.
Thanks, Maria. Hi, everyone. My name is Teresa Guerra, and I'm the Chief of Staff at United for Respect, as Maria mentioned. Just a little about myself. I have done electoral work for nearly 2 decades, running campaigns and working for national and state democratic organizations across the country. So a little bit about United for Respect. We are an organization that fights at the intersection of economic and racial justice for people who work at the biggest retailers in the country, including people who work at Walmart, at Amazon, and retail companies owned by Wall Street. We also have a civic engagement arm called Vote for Respect. It mobilizes low-wage voters in states of Georgia, Michigan, North Carolina, and Texas. Now, we are excited to present this research today and share tested messages we know could help drive turnout in the upcoming election. Now, we realize the election is just a few short weeks away, but these tools would give voters the final push in the home stretch. So first, let me start from the start of this project. It really started for both Americans for Financial Reform and us. with Toys R Us workers who were laid off from their longtime jobs because two Wall Street private equity firms bought up the profitable and popular toy store company. These Wall Street private equity firms saddled the company with debt, cut pay and benefits for workers, and when they could not extract any more, they filed for bankruptcy, laying off over 30,000 workers across the country. The executives, they walked away with millions of dollars in their pocket. Those workers were left with nothing. Now, these extractive tactics were not just a one-off, but we saw it over and over again, company after company. It was part of a larger playbook that was driving job loss and economic crisis across communities. And they didn't just dabble in retail. Wall Street private equity, they own homes in our neighborhood, are responsible for excessive medical billing. They own adult daycare centers, private prisons, pet stores, and grocery stores. That's why we've been pushing for the Stop Wall Street Looting Act in the Senate, and why these Senate contests really matter for members. Wall Street spends tens of millions to push their agenda, and we have to build a powerful movement to push ours. Wall Street private equity and big corporations are the drivers of our economy. And right now, whether you are a low-wage worker or not, you have seen the impact of inflation. Working people see it at the pump, at the grocery store, and when it's passed through to them through rent increases. And let me tell you, this is disproportionately impacting people of color, women of color, particularly in the South. Now, we started this research because we knew from conversations with working people across the country and with voters that inflation was a hot topic and that Wall Street as a driver is responsible. We have to tell that story. And in fact, it is a crucial part of our path to victory in this election. Now, in 2022, our civic engagement program, Vote for Respect, contacted 1 million low propensity voters. We think that this is a strategy this cycle of reaching and reactivating these so-called surge voters who do not reliably vote in midterms and advancing a narrative of Wall Street greed is important to victory. Surge voters are generally younger, lower in income, and more BIPOC than a typical high turnout score voter sample. Our message testing results show exceptionally high concern with inflation among this often overlooked segment of the electorate. And it shows the efficiency of an anti-corporate economic justice messaging to motivate voter behavior. Now, I hope these tools today we are sharing will be helpful as you have conversations with voters and motivate them to show up for this important election. So thanks everyone for being here. I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to Ryan O'Donnell for Data for Progress.
My name is Ryan O'Donnell. I'm the Electoral Director at Data for Progress. And if someone would share my presentation, I can start going over the poll for everybody. Great, thank you. So yeah, we were in the field polling the surge voters that were just discussed from September 2nd to the 14th. We reached about 650 of them. We used Georgia here. We sampled them from a variety of modes, and the margin of error is about 4 percentage points. And like was discussed, the surge voter here is someone who we defined who have a high likelihood of voting in a presidential election, but a low likelihood in voting in a midterm election. And as was discussed, the demographics here are a bit different than a typical likely voter turnout universe, which is, there's more women, it's 10% Hispanic, 54% of the sample was under 45, and only 33% had a college education. So you can move on to the next slide here. Thanks. And just to give you a little bit of a sense of how we ran this poll, we had some intro questions along with some general gut check questions about government and people trusted different types of organizations. We did a split ask that I'll talk about in a minute about corporations. Then we asked folks how likely they were to vote in the upcoming midterm election. And then after that, we gave them a grid of all of our messages. We tested 6 different messages and asked people to tell us how convincing they thought that was as a reason to vote. And then we asked them again, if they were likely to vote in the upcoming midterm election. And then finally, we ran what's called a max diff experiment here, which is basically just a fancy way of saying that we basically distilled the messages that we showed them earlier, but instead of allowing people just to tell us what was very convincing or not very convincing about it, we asked them to rank what was most convincing and least convincing against each other. So as opposed to just allowing people to rate each one individually, we kind of forced them to choose them against each other, which forced a rank here, which I think illuminated some of the results we found prior. And then, so yeah, this is one of the first things that we wanted to share from here was that we'd asked how much folks trust the government to create policies to benefit the following groups. And you can see that there's very little trust for the government to create policies that benefit these groups, except for two, right? People trust the government to work very hard for upper class citizens and big corporations. And everything else after that is a huge drop off, right? Parents, children, students, elderly citizens, et cetera. You know, usually single digits down there, and all the way at the bottom is working class citizens, which is what people think have lots of trust in the government to create beneficial policies for. Thanks. And then this question was helpful for our thought process, I think, which was that we asked, we split this sample in half, and we asked if the government should be doing more or less to regulate either big corporations or private equity firms like the Blackstone Group and the Carlyle Group. And big corporations tested better here. They both tested well. A majority of each said that the government should be doing more to regulate these. Our theories as to why big corporations perform better is mostly, we think, you could see here that you could, if you look at the don't know rate here, you could see that I think it seems like it was largely the that people didn't know as much about private equity firms, right? Like I think everybody has a fairly decent sense of what a big corporation is and how much they're regulated by the government, which the private equity firms, they know less about that. So I think that's important for us to know here. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't be talking about private equity firms, you know, directly, but it does mean that we need to define them first, because I think people aren't quite sure how much they're being regulated right now, and how much they should be, unlike big corporations, which is a bit more overwhelming in the sense of how they should be regulated. Cool. And then, so this is where I talked about the convincing grid of messages here, right? Where we tested these 6 messages, and basically the top 2 were inflation, and specifically inflation around countering monopolies. And then there was also a freedom frame that tested pretty well. The inflation and monopolies frame did the best of people that said very convincing and somewhat convincing by like a decent amount. But freedom was up there, so we wanted to include that as well. And so, you know, basically, this is something that we saw across the board in this poll, right? Which was that people just kept coming back to us and saying that, you know, inflation and the economy are the most important thing right now. And when that was reflected in our messaging, people reacted to it. And you could see that across, you know, pretty much all polls right now, which is that inflation and the economy are of the main and likely the main issue that voters care about right now. And this is no different with the surge voters that we tested in Georgia. And so these are the 2, and we can talk about them more in a bit. I'm not going to read out the full messages because some of them were you know, a few sentences long, but and they are in our write-up of this as well. But inflation and monopolies performed the best, but also there was a freedom frame, which was just like, you know, I think that we did see a reaction from folks when we said that, you know, here in Georgia, we value our freedom, but some private equity billionaires are trying to take that freedom away. You know, I think that the inflation message reflected what people were thinking and wanted to hear. And also we gave them a reason for why things were going on, which I think is why the monopolies part of the inflation messaging was most powerful here was that we gave them a reason. I think people said that makes sense to me. But also there is something about the framing of the freedom that and taking our freedoms away that made people react well too. And this is where you could see that, like, if you saw in the last poll, right, like there was some differentiation between messages in the very convincing and somewhat convincing, if you add those together. But this is the part where we basically forced people to rank them, essentially. And you could see that the inflation and monopolies one, it was a slightly distilled message because we didn't want to send them 4 or 5 sentences again, but the inflation monopolies message performed the best here when we forced them to choose, but freedom was right up there as well, which is why we're, I think, taking into account some form of that. Like the freedom messaging is a good one, but people care most about inflation right now, and they kind of agree with the monopoly standpoint. And just as a note on the other 4 messages, as you could probably have seen from the last slide, they all actually performed fairly well, fairly well here. Just some better than others. And just the way that the kind of math works on the back end of this, negative here doesn't necessarily mean bad. It just, is the way that the math comes together in the max diff, that it puts some as positive and some as negative, and they kind of overlap for 0, but it doesn't mean backlash or anything. So it doesn't mean that the messages that we were testing, push people backward. It just means that more people said that this was least convincing, as opposed to the other ones that they found most convincing. But it doesn't mean that, it doesn't mean that people said that it was a reason to not vote or anything, because I know that seeing negative numbers and seeing red is sometimes makes you think that, but just to reiterate, that's not what it means. People just found it least convincing when they were forced to choose against the other ones. And yeah, I think this is our last slide. And yeah, and so major takeaways here that I kind of said throughout, but I'll just specify here is that these voters were pretty much very clear across the entire survey that inflation and the economy were their top concerns right now. So if leaning into everyday financial concerns that people relate to is very important, and also who is the cause for that, because I think, a lot of people don't get that messaging. Big corporations here can be a target, but voters are not quite familiar enough with private equity firms to single them out individually, which was a good note. So again, private equity firms do need to be defined a bit for people before it can explain for some of their behavior here. And also, even though there were 2 separate messages, we do think that tying in broader freedom frames around a discussion of economic concerns can be a fruitful avenue here for motivating these surge voters. And so that's what we saw overall. So thank you all, and I'll kick it back to you.
Now passing these on to Doyle, who is going to talk to us a little more about the tool that you can use for your electoral work. Doyle, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you so much. Great to be with you. Isis, can you show me slide 6? Wonderful, thank you. All right, so as you just heard from Ryan, inflation was the top concern of the voters that we surveyed in Georgia, the surge voter sample that we did, and that this is consistent with multiple other surveys by many different pollsters and researchers, and you can see it here in recent news coverage. This was the top performer for us, 42% at the top line, 47% for Black surge voters in Georgia. And this is consistent with a number of other surveys, which means that we can speculate that these findings could be applied with other segments in other states. Inflation is definitely on people's minds, and they want to hear what Democrats are going to do about it. Can you show me the next slide? So I think one of our main kind of take-home messages for you who have come to hear more about this research is that inflation doesn't have to hurt us if we tell a story about corporate greed. There is a kind of assumption that Republicans are running on inflation and high prices, and so Democrats should steer clear. But to shy away from this conversation, particularly with this segment of surge voters who are really looking for answers and looking for leadership on how we're going to solve this, Democrats need to jump in and need to talk about this and talk about it in terms of who's to blame. It's Wall Street, it's private equity, it's big corporations. We'll talk a bit more about how to name that villain and that bully. But Democrats are the ones who are going to do something about it. And that's why you should show up and vote in this midterm election, even if you've never done that before. I want to talk next about this freedom frame that Ryan alluded to a bit. So there is a very impressive and comprehensive messaging project going on that's called Protect Our Freedoms. That's being led by some fantastic researchers and messaging experts and political operatives at Way to Win and ASO Communications and about, I don't know, at least a dozen other organizations. And through their research, they've really come up with this recommendation around a meta narrative for this election, that if it's a referendum on the ruling part, on the party in power, as is typically the case in a midterm election, Democrats are at a bit of a disadvantage. We've got to make this a referendum on the far right and discuss this election in terms of the stakes for our freedoms. So using some of the formulations that Anat Shenker-Osorio and ASO Communications and many other practitioners have been developing over the past several years for developing these kinds of narrative messages. They say open with a shared value. That value is freedom. Describe the villains, in this case, MAGA Republicans, Trump Republicans, and then use that value of freedom to talk about the issues that voters care about or the issues that your organization is campaigning on. In this case, we talk about economic justice and then reinforce the agency, the power that voters have to change the outcome and the power of collective action. So this is kind of the scaffolding, if you will, of this Protect Our Freedoms meta narrative. Now, in the next slide, I'll show you how we adapted this and remixed this and tested it with voters in Georgia. So I call this the private equity edition. So we open with a shared value. In Georgia, we value our freedom. Then we describe the villains. In this case, private equity billionaires or big corporations who are spending on certain politicians who want to take our freedoms away. So we have a kind of nod here to this broader narrative of protecting our freedom to determine our own families and futures, which is a bit of a nod to the threat to abortion rights. But what we're focused on is our freedom to prosper and really defining economic justice as freedom. Real freedom is about more than making a living. It's also about having time to take a loved one to the doctor, attend a parent-teacher conference, retire in dignity. You know, these are the kinds of brownies, as Anat would say, the kind of vision that we want to spread about what life would be like if our economic system was more fair and we had the right people in governance making that happen. So then we have a reinforcement of that call to action. Protect our freedoms from these private equity moguls and stand together and vote on November 8th. So this performed very well. It's a very experimental kind of message that we're trying to do here. We're mixing up a lot of different ingredients. We've got the Protect Our Freedoms frame. We've got a lot of content about private equity and financialization, which is quite complex. And we've got a call to action to vote. But to our surprise, this one performed very well. So we wanted to share it with you and encourage you to, remix this in your own ways and get out there and use it to talk with voters about inflation. The other message that we want to share with you that Ryan referenced as the best performer, the inflation monopolies. If you can show me that one, Isis. Was another sort of remix using the race class narrative formula to get more specific about those, what you might call kitchen table concerns, those very specific ways that the squeeze on working class people is coming from private equity into your everyday life. Groceries, healthcare, housing being some of the major ones. So in this version, we don't use freedom per se, but we still use the architecture of the race class narrative to talk about this content. Some greedy private equity billionaires are getting away with overcharging Georgians for the things that we need, like groceries, healthcare, and housing. And then we explain what we mean by monopolies. A few mega firms buy up many hospitals, rental properties, retailers, or food companies. And then those few jack up their prices and pocket the profits. It should be against the law, but that's why we have to elect different lawmakers. And so that's a bit about the inflation monopoly message, how to talk about something that's quite, and intentionally so, opaque and complex in a way that really connects to the everyday concerns of these surge voters who are telling us that inflation is what they care about and what they're worried about. So back to these results again that Ryan shared, we see that freedom frame, that those are the two messages that we tested, and we wanted to give you, the longer form version of what that actually looks like. Okay, so a little note about this question of using private equity, big corporations, billionaires. We mixed up a few different ways of going about this to name, who is responsible for why your grocery bill is in some cases 30% higher right now. As Ryan said, somewhat to our surprise, Wall Street private equity, using the names of brand names of specific firms like the Blackstone Group, the Carlyle Group, the majority responded well to that. Like it did better than we thought it would, given how kind of intentionally shady these actors are, and how unfamiliar these brand names and this discourse of private equity is to people in general and these voters. So for the most part, they were feeling it, but there was a higher don't know score on that than big corporations. Everybody knows what big corporations are. So we want to sort of encourage you to use big corporations for a general kind of progressive program. United for Respect and Americans for Financial Reform we have a specific political project that we're doing here, which is to name and shame these private equity firms and to build the appetite for more regulation through the Stop Wall Street Looting Act and other measures in Washington. And we want to kind of raise the profile of private equity. So that's why we were specifically testing that language, and we'll continue to kind of pepper it into our program, but we encourage you to do that if you want, but know that big corporations test better. So what does this look like in the application? We have a memorandum that walks through these findings and also gives you this language that you can cut and paste and remix as you like and as you find works well in the context that you're working in. For United for Respect, right now there's a lot of voter contact going, which Jess is gonna talk a bit about briefly. And she tells me that this is the highest performing content that they have in their texting program. So Jess, tell us more about that. How's it going? And anything you want to share with people who joined today about how this is looking in practice.
Thank you all so much for this great introduction. So yes, as Doyle said, I have the distinction of being able to talk about actually utilizing this messaging on the ground. As Maria mentioned, I am the political manager here. So I'm running our civic engagement work. We are still working in the 4 states of Michigan, Georgia, North Carolina, and Texas, and we are running this economic justice message in all of those 4 states. We're doing this primarily via text and calls. And we are running this alongside a strong choice, protect our freedoms message. What we are finding is this universe is, in fact, much more strongly responding to this economic justice message, calling out by name that folks are feeling the pain at the pump, they're feeling it at the grocery store, they're feeling it in their energy bills, and connecting it very, very strongly to this corporate greed message, blaming it on Wall Street, blaming it on billionaires and CEOs price gouging regular Americans. And folks are responding very well to this, as I said. What I will say is that people will ask, what are Democrats doing? So you do have to be able to respond to that. Luckily, our Congress, our pro-worker Congress, passed the Inflation Reduction Act. And so we have been prepared with very specific statistics, and there are specific statistics. I'm losing my words today. Specific statistics, say that 3 times fast, by state about exactly what amount of money is going back in workers' pockets, how this is going to be spent to build a clean and green energy future, et cetera. So one anecdote that I can share that was really exciting, we were texting voters in Michigan with this message, and a voter asked, why should I vote for the Republican Light Party? You know, what have they done for me? And we wrote back with the specific work that the Congress has done to bring hundreds of thousands of dollars in, specific funding for workers' projects, for clean energy, et cetera. And we had that in our recommended replies. We were able to send that right away. The response was terrific. Thank you for being prepared to talk to a voter like me. My ballot is going in the mail tomorrow. So not only are we getting a strong response to this message, like I said, with the caveat that we do have to talk about what Democrats are doing to fight back. Folks are responding when we say how folks are fighting back. And I think it just makes sense. You can't, people know that they're spending more on groceries. They know that they're spending more on their energy bills. It's in the news. They're hearing about it all the time. They're not just hearing about it from Republicans. They're hearing about it if they listen to the radio, if they have broadcast on. And so by connecting with them on those issues, affirming that their pain, and affirming that this is how we fight back, and these are who to blame, and this is the solution, we are finding a great deal of people reacting to us, engaging with our texts and our calls. And again, like I said, someone was convinced by our messaging to go ahead and turn around and put his ballot out. We're still in the midst of our voter contact program, so we're continuing to send out these text messages all day long, and we will be doing that through Election Day. So we're working on getting even more data to confirm what we know is working, and I'm excited to be able to give this little dispatch from the field.
Thank you so much, everyone. This has been a lot of information, and now it's really time for you all to tell us what you think and all your questions. And I would like to invite you to use the Q&A feature, not the chat, but the Q&A. I'm going to be receiving questions from you, and I'm going to pass them on to our experts. So give us 1 minute to collect some of the questions. And in the meantime, I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll put in the chat the actual, what I call the toolkit of what you've heard today, especially the piece that you heard from Doyle. This is the link that I would love for you all to download, but don't worry, because we're also going to email it to you, and probably we'll have a site where you can download it as well. But if you caught that, sorry, I think I just sent it to one person. I am going to go ahead and send it to everyone. And I hope it works out. All right. Okay, I have one question. Oh, okay, sorry. Let me see. No, we're getting in questions. Thank you so much. Okay. So I have one from Chris Berg. It says, was the data for progress sample all registered voters? Was there any testing of propensity to vote down ballot races?
Hey, yeah, that's a great question. So yeah, we sampled all registered voters here to gauge, whether or not they were likely to vote in this midterm already, what their past vote history was, things like that, to try to gauge whether or not we wanted to define them as surge voters in this instance or not. And we just tested, we just tested the top line kind of vote likelihood question here of, there will be election this November for, governor and Senate and local offices and things like that. And so we gauged them at the top line there, and we didn't ask about lower ones, but I think, I would imagine that this message would work across races.
Okay, awesome. Where can I view the recording of this session? We are going to email everybody who came today to this webinar, but also everybody who registered. And also, if you know of other folks that need this or that this would be exciting for them, please go ahead and share it really wide, cast a wide net there. So this will be widely available for you all. And we are, we are very excited to hear back from you about what happened. So you tested it in the field, and then was it successful? What did you hear? We would love to collect your input after this. This is kind of like the most important part of this whole project, is to hear back from you. Okay, so most definitely you can get this information. We'll make it widely available. Let's see. Here's a good one. Should people with pensions be concerned about private equity investments, the costs charged, and do they have to be fiduciaries when involved with pensions?
Yes, the short answer is yes, and yes. People should be concerned about private equity investments and with pension investment in private equity. So the short answer is yes to all of that. They should be concerned about it. I think we've seen in the past that pensions, they get a lot in return from private equity. So it's hard to convince them that they shouldn't be that they should at least be responsible investors, especially to working people. We saw that. That's one of the first places we went to pension boards to talk about how private equity firms that they were investing in were treating working people. And we found very friendly ears and surprise about what was happening with working people.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Teresa, for that. And I've been just answering about access to these slides as well as the messaging. I hope you're all receiving it in the Q&A. I put the link there again and in the chat. So a question from Rochelle Kaplan. Has the GOP said what specifically they will do to curb inflation? Has anybody in our panelists heard anything? They're using this messaging, but I'm not sure I hear what's the solution.
I would say in general, their narrative is that government spending through the pandemic is the cause of inflation. And so programs like the child tax credit or stimulus checks or, other supports through the American Rescue Plan and even the IRA are inflationary. And therefore you should elect Republicans who will stop throwing government money on a pile that's already inflated. So the Inflation Reduction Act has a number of measures in place, including, and I think this should be emphasized in those replies that you talked about, Jess, taxing the ultra wealthy and corporations. That is an important way to capture some of that capital. And so it is an anti-inflation measure that Democrats are taking, and also a long overdue tax fairness piece of legislation. We all wish it went further, I think, but it's a good start. So yeah, that would be my response to that. So I think it's really kind of playing into the very kind of old trope that Republicans have about like tax and spend liberals.
Awesome. I am getting so many good questions. I don't know which one to give you guys, and they're all a bit of commentary to which I love. Here's another one. Does tying in Dems law to tax big corporations help? If yes, shouldn't we tie this in? Who would like to take that one?
I'm happy to say, so we absolutely did include that in some of our messages. I don't know that it was specifically tested by Data for Progress, but that is something that is related and 100% resonating with this space as well. It's tied to this idea of reining in corporate greed. And in our response messages, we do talk about the tax on billionaires as one of the measures that Democrats have taken.
Thank you. Another one, to reduce the pricing power of big corporations, are the resolving solutions to inflation a combination of a windfall profit tax, price controls, and antitrust enforcement laws?
Could you restate it, Maria?
Absolutely. So to reduce the pricing power of big corporations, or the price gouging, I think, of big corporations, are the resolving solutions to inflation a combination of windfall profit tax, price controls, and antitrust enforcement laws?
Yeah, I know there's I can just say, I know that there's been legislation introduced specifically on price controls by, I know Jamal Bowman was a major sponsor of that, specifically as one of the measures to combat inflation, but short answer is yes to all of the above, and also the Stop Wall Street Looting Act.
Stop Wall Street Looting Act. Awesome. I want to just mention a comment from Dr. Forrest Shirley Thompson. This is the strongest intersectional closing message I have heard thus far, affirming that we care and have policies to help. What ad, billboards, text are using this? So thank you for that, Dr. Thompson. Another comment, and then I'll keep on reading questions, but this has been invaluable. Thank you. I've been writing GeoTV postcards. Do you have polling on that?
So not yet, but we are running a postcard test. And Teresa, I don't know if you want to take this at all too, but I'm happy to talk about it. So we are incorporating this messaging into a postcard that's going to 50,000 voters across the state of Michigan, with, like I said, an explicit message tying Wall Street greed and PE to the cost of gas and groceries. And the solution is voting Democrats that will fight back for working families. So stay tuned for some feedback on that.
Awesome.
Yeah, and we haven't done any polling directly on postcards, like actual polling, but there has been experiments done by other organizations and stuff that show some statistical significance of increased turnout when postcards are being used.
I think this next one, it could be for Ryan. Which is the percentage of surge voters in Georgia? Here in Maryland is around 40 to 50%. And
yeah,
I'm typing, sorry.
Oh yeah, no problem. Yeah, I can just say it here. So yeah, I think probably the best way to, I mean, this is, more approximated, and in the sense that like you would, like the way that we actually built the probability sample was taking the people with a low likelihood to vote in midterm elections in general, and a high likelihood to vote in presidential generals. And so I'm not exactly sure what that hard number of registered voter is, but I think probably a similar version is just to take how many votes there were in 2018 and kind of compare that to how many votes there were in 2020. And in Georgia in 2018, there were about 3.9 million votes in the midterm, and there were about 5 million votes in the first round of the general. And so that'll probably equate to about 25% of the electors.
Thanks, Ryan. Another question, one from Helen Brosnan. Did any of your questions or messages related to inflation also include monopolies' broader role in our economy and political system? Or were they just about rising prices, their outsized power?
Great question. So we did test a message that was connecting this kind of corporate influence in politics, and Wall Street is spending big on certain politicians, that kind of messaging, and connecting it to concern about broader systemic themes of democracy. And like Ryan showed you, all of the messages did pretty good. but that one didn't rise to the top. And so, it worked, but it wasn't the most salient. The most salient were these more specific concerns about high prices for consumer goods and housing and energy. So take that what you will. The ones we're recommending that are in this memorandum that we're going to send you are the two I showed, the protecting our freedoms from private equity billionaires and the more kitchen table inflation concerns.
Awesome. Boy, we keep on getting questions. I'll give you one more. Dr. Thompson says, do you think we should name the corporations that are rising prices on groceries, dollar store, meat, Tyson's, monopolistic market concentrations, and distribution centers? Reason for price gouging? Should we intersect this? I think the answer is yes, but who would like to expand?
I can expand a little bit here. I think in that, I think if in your area, you think that is easily identifiable with voters and just residents of that area in general, that they can actually pinpoint this. They know who the corporation is. They can feel it in their community. Then it's a very good idea. Whereas if you start off by just talking about it and people might not be able to relate it very well, then we see that it requires a little more uncertainty, or it breeds a little bit more uncertainty when you talk to folks about that. But if it's something that's dead set in the community, people know about it, people see the prices going up, then that it is that their prices are inflated beyond a certain percent, then I would say that it should definitely be a good idea.
Can I take this last question about, aren't there some good corporations?
Yes, please go ahead.
And this is an important finding from the Protect Our Freedoms team, who's very focused on kind of a direct confrontation with Republicans in this election, and fascism versus freedom being kind of the conflict. And what they found is, and they have done extensive research, is that even those voters who are Democrats or who lean strong in our direction are still turned off by a kind of broad brush. So just saying Republicans in general. So that's why they're very intentionally using language like MAGA Republicans or Trump Republicans or certain politicians, some billionaires, some private equity firms. And so it's a subtle kind of nuance, but it's an important one for kind of bringing people into our story. Their analysis on this was the Protect Our Freedoms crew, and not Shenker Osorio specifically, when I asked her about this, was there's a general kind of fatigue after the Trump years, and people are really looking for a way forward, and are exhausted by politics in general. And so not painting all with a broad brush is an important persuasion tactic. And so this question about do we say all corporations? No, some big corporations, some MAGA Republicans, etc.
Super helpful distinction. We are right on the hour, and we want to just thank you for your participation, your incredible and encouraging comments and questions. And this is just the beginning of the conversation, but don't forget that we also want to hear from you on what happened. Did you use the messages, and how did it go? So we will stay in close touch. We have a list of your emails and also people who register. We will continue to share our toolkit in case you haven't seen it in the chat or in the Q&A where I posted it. And you will receive an email with all this information. So for this incredibly thoughtful participation, we thank you so much and hope you have a wonderful day, and go fight win. Thank you all.